The city of Atlanta pulsed with vitality. Car horns blared, streetlights cast flickering reflections across the glassy facades of towering buildings, and pedestrians moved with determined purpose. Yet, just a few blocks from the vibrant downtown, nestled within a quieter neighborhood, stood Brooklyn Market, a modest corner store. Its neon sign flickers intermittently, and its tightly packed aisles offered only the essentials. To Darius Thompson, however, this small grocery store was more than a workplace. It was a cornerstone of his life. For over 5 years, Darius, now 27, had stood behind the checkout counter at Brooklyn Market. In that time, he had encountered a diverse array of customers: mothers balancing groceries and restless toddlers, construction workers grabbing quick meals after long shifts, and elderly regulars seeking a moment of conversation. To each, Darius offered more than a transaction. He provided recognition. It was not merely about scanning barcodes or issuing receipts. It was about recalling Mrs. Emily Carter's preferred chamomile tea, inquiring after Mr. James Howell's recovery from hip surgery, or noticing when someone appeared burdened by a difficult day. Standing at the register, Darius ran a hand over his closely cropped hair, his gaze shifting toward the entrance as the bell above the door chimed softly. A gust of crisp autumn air slipped inside as a man hesitated on the threshold. He wore a threadbare jacket, a beanie pulled low over his brow, and his shoulders hunched as if shielding himself from more than the evening chill. Darius recognized the posture, the subtle reluctance of someone uncertain of their welcome. "Good evening," Darius called out, his voice calm and inviting. "It's chilly out there tonight. Let me know if you need help finding anything." The man offered a faint nod but remained silent, stepping cautiously into the store as though avoiding undue attention. Darius observed as the stranger navigated the aisles, his eyes lingering on price tags and his fingers hovering over the least expensive items. Eventually, he approached the counter with a modest selection: a loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, and a protein bar, barely enough to constitute a meal, but sufficient to stave off hunger. As he reached into his pocket, his trembling hands produced a crumpled $5 bill and a handful of loose change, which he placed on the counter with a quiet sigh. Before even scanning the items, Darius calculated the total in his mind. The man was short. The customer swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the protein bar. "I'll just put this back," he murmured, his voice tinged with resignation. Darius, however, did not pause to consider his response. He had witnessed this scenario too often, the silent shame that caused people to withdraw into themselves. Without a word, he rang up all 3 items, discreetly covering the difference from his own pocket. "No need to worry," he said, sliding the bag across the counter with a reassuring smile. "We all need a little help sometimes." For the first time since entering, the man looked up, his expression inscrutable, perhaps a mix of surprise and suspicion, as though unaccustomed to kindness without conditions. After a brief pause, his shoulders relaxed, and he exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough, as if the words were unfamiliar. "You have no idea what this means." Darius nodded simply. "Take care," he replied. The man clutched the bag tightly to his chest, as though it contained something far more precious than groceries, and slipped out into the cold night. Darius gave the encounter little further thought. It was not the first time he had assisted a struggling customer, nor would it be the last. To him, the act was straightforward. If one could ease another's burden, why would they not? Unbeknownst to Darius, however, the man he had aided was no ordinary patron. He was Nathaniel Brooks, the billionaire CEO of Brooks Retail Group, one of the nation's largest grocery chains. That small, selfless gesture was about to alter the course of Darius's life in ways he could not yet imagine. Nathaniel Brooks sat in his car across the street from Brooklyn Market, the brown paper bag resting on the passenger seat beside him. His fingers traced the edges of the receipt, as he stared through the windshield, his mind replaying the moment at the counter. The warmth in Darius's voice, the absence of hesitation or judgment, lingered in his thoughts. It was a simple, uncalculated kindness, something Nathaniel had rarely encountered. For most of his life, people had treated him according to his wealth, not his character. They saw him as a billionaire, a figure of influence, a name tied to salaries and stock values. Yet decades ago, he had been a young man bagging groceries in a store much like this one, aware that kindness was often a tool for personal gain. Darius, however, had given without expecting anything in return. It unsettled Nathaniel deeply. He exhaled, his breath fogging the glass, and shifted the car into drive. He had not intended to visit Brooklyn Market in disguise, nor had he planned to test his company's stores like some undercover executive. The decision had been impulsive, driven by a growing disconnect between himself and the business he had built from nothing. His board of directors spoke of profits, his regional managers emphasized efficiency, but who considered the people? As his company expanded, it had become unrecognizable. Employees were reduced to numbers on spreadsheets, their struggles obscured by corporate policies. Reports of underpaid workers and stagnant wages had reached him before, discussed in boardrooms by men in tailored suits. Until tonight, those reports had remained abstract. Now, they were real. The bell above Brooklyn Market's door had chimed like those from his youth. The shelves carried the familiar scents of dust, cardboard, and cheap disinfectant. Then there was Darius, standing behind the counter, embodying the human reality of a business Nathaniel had controlled from a distance for years. Nathaniel had not planned to purchase anything. He had simply wanted to observe, to search for what his company had lost. When he came up short at the register, the shame had returned, a visceral memory of his days as a broke 19-year-old, wondering if anyone cared. Darius, a stranger unaware of his identity, had smiled and preserved his dignity without a second thought. Nathaniel clenched his jaw and glanced at the market's glowing sign. This store was not part of his chain. It was a family-owned business, free from the cost-cutting measures his managers deemed essential. Yet, Darius had upheld values Nathaniel had once founded his empire upon, values his executives seemed to have forgotten. He reached into the glove compartment and retrieved a leather-bound notebook. Its pages contained meticulous notes from previous store visits, statistics, observations, and anonymous complaints. Tonight, for the first time in years, he wrote something different. He inscribed a name, Darius Thompson, and beneath it a single question: how many more like him have we overlooked? The following evening, Nathaniel returned to Brooklyn Market. This visit was not a test or a fact-finding mission. Something about Darius, about this place, had taken root in his mind. He had spent decades building a company on the efforts of individuals like this cashier, people who worked long hours for wages that barely covered rent, who gave more to their jobs than the company ever reciprocated. Standing before the store's weathered glass doors, Nathaniel wondered how many of them had ever been truly seen. He stepped inside, the bell chiming softly. The store smelled as it had the previous night, a blend of spilled coffee, old linoleum, and faint detergent. A few customers moved through the narrow aisles, their carts rattling against the tiled floor. Nathaniel's gaze settled on Darius, who stood behind the counter, scanning items with the same attentive presence. He greeted each customer warmly, some by name, others with a kind smile. Nathaniel watched as Darius cracked a joke with an elderly man fumbling for his wallet, then stepped from behind the counter to assist a mother with two restless children. When a nervous teenager approached, Darius subtly added a small bag of chips to his order without ringing it up. The boy's shoulders eased as he muttered a thank you, as if that small gesture had preserved his fragile dignity. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. In 5 minutes, Darius had done more for his customers than many of Nathaniel's store managers accomplished in a week. Then, a new figure entered the store, catching Nathaniel's attention. The man wore a cheap suit, the kind favored by middle managers striving to appear authoritative. He was short, with slicked-back blonde hair and a smug confidence that suggested he believed himself superior to those around him. Nathaniel recognized the type immediately. He had employed men like this. The man strode directly to the counter, cutting ahead of the line without hesitation. Darius, ever composed, finished ringing up a woman's groceries before addressing him. "Evening, Mr. Spencer," Darius said, his voice steady and polite. Nathaniel tensed. This was the store's manager, Eric Spencer. The man barely glanced at Darius. "Thompson," he said curtly, pulling a folded paper from his pocket and tossing it onto the counter. "Payroll's locked. No raises this quarter." Nathaniel observed as Darius's fingers gripped the counter's edge for a fleeting moment before he exhaled and nodded. "Understood," he replied simply. Spencer smirked. "Didn't think you'd push back. Smart. Some people don't know when to quit." Nathaniel felt a stillness settle over him. Darius absorbed the insult without reaction, his gaze lifting to meet Spencer's. In that same measured tone, he asked, "Is there anything else you need, sir?" Spencer scoffed. "Nah, I just wanted to deliver the news myself. Better than another rejection email." With that, he turned and left, strutting out as if he had performed a commendable deed. Darius released a slow breath, folding the paper with deliberate care and tucking it beneath the register. He resumed work, ringing up the next customer as though nothing had occurred. Nathaniel, however, had seen it all. The way Darius swallowed his frustration, the brief tightening of his jaw, the quiet resilience honed by years of enduring dismissal. Nathaniel knew that weight. He had carried it himself long ago. Now, a sharp indignation burned within him, directed not only at Spencer, but at himself. He had built this company, fought for it, convinced himself every decision served a greater good. When had he stopped seeing the people who sustained it? When had he allowed men like Spencer to represent his stores? Nathaniel turned toward the exit, his mind racing. Change was imperative, and it would begin immediately. Nathaniel Brooks did not sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as Eric Spencer's words replayed in his mind. Some people don't know when to quit. The casual delivery, the underlying disdain, carried a weight that Nathaniel could not dismiss. As a young man, he had endured similar remarks, the kind that reminded him of his place in a world ruled by those with power. He had clawed his way out of that existence, building Brooks' retail group from the ground up. Yet, somewhere along the way, he had allowed men like Spencer to thrive within his company, perpetuating the very dynamics he had once fought against. By morning, Nathaniel's decision was firm. He would not merely address this injustice. He would dismantle the systems that enabled it and rebuild something better. At noon, he sat in his office, facing a conference table lined with executives. Their expressions betrayed unease, like men sensing an approaching storm. "I want payroll reports from every store in the region," Nathaniel said, his voice calm but resolute. "Turnover rates, employee complaints, and a list of every worker denied raises in the past 3 years, along with the decision-makers responsible." A brief silence followed, interrupted only by a hesitant throat-clearing. "Sir, if this is about," an executive began, but Nathaniel's sharp glance silenced him. "I wasn't finished," he said coolly. "I also require a full review of our regional management. If I find a single policy prioritizing profits over people, I will begin terminations from the top down." The room grew heavy with discomfort. Many of these executives had grown complacent, assuming Nathaniel had become another detached billionaire, indifferent to the cracks in his empire. They had misjudged him. He let the tension linger, then rose from his chair. "You have 24 hours, he said, turning toward the door. "Do not waste them." He left without awaiting a response, his focus already shifting to a more pressing matter. That evening, Nathaniel returned to Brooklyn Market. Through the window, he observed Darius at work, still offering smiles and quiet support to his customers. The man bore the same resilience Nathaniel had seen before, undeterred by the previous night's rejection. Tonight, however, Nathaniel was not a disguised customer. He was the CEO who signed the checks, determined to set things right. He stepped inside, the bell chiming softly. The store's familiar scents, cheap coffee, citrus disinfectant, and aging linoleum filled the air. The atmosphere felt charged, though perhaps only to Nathaniel, who carried the weight of his intent. Darius stood behind the counter, scanning items with steady focus. There was no trace of the frustration Spencer had provoked, only the practiced composure of someone accustomed to moving forward. Nathaniel approached as the last customer departed. Darius looked up, his expression shifting to recognition. "Back again?" he asked, his tone even but curious. Nathaniel nodded. "Yes, though I figured I should pay for my groceries this time." A flicker of amusement crossed Darius's face, though he did not press further. Instead, he gestured to the counter. "Got something to check out?" Nathaniel exhaled, squaring his shoulders. "Not exactly. I'm here about something else." He withdrew a business card from his coat pocket and placed it on the counter. The embossed letters glinted under the overhead light. Darius glanced at it, then froze. His eyes traced the name, Nathaniel Brooks, CEO of Brooks Retail Group, his brows knitting as he processed the revelation. When he looked up, his demeanor had sharpened, guarded yet assessing. Nathaniel spoke before he could respond. "I should have introduced myself properly that first night," he said, his voice deliberate. "Nathaniel Brooks, CEO of Brooks Retail Group." Darius remained still for a moment, then leaned back slightly. A quiet laugh escaped him, not of humor, but of disbelief. "Well," he said at last, his voice low, "that explains a lot." Nathaniel studied him, noting the subtle tension in his hands, the way his shoulders braced as if anticipating a shift in power. "I heard what happened last night with Spencer," Nathaniel said evenly. Darius's jaw flexed. "You hear a lot for someone who doesn't work here." Nathaniel inclined his head. "I make it my business to know." He paused, then leaned forward. "You deserve that raise, Darius. Not just you, but every employee in my company who's been underpaid, overlooked, or dismissed by managers like him. That changes today." Darius did not reply immediately, but the air between them thickened with unspoken weight. Nathaniel produced a document from his pocket and slid it across the counter. "This is an official offer," he said, watching as Darius hesitated before lifting it. "A corporate position in community outreach and employee development. It includes a salary that reflects your contributions, benefits, and a budget." Darius's fingers tightened on the paper. "A budget for what?" Nathaniel's lips curved faintly. "For whatever you need to launch that café you've been planning." Darius inhaled sharply. A brief crack in his composure revealed surprise. Nathaniel had pieced it together, small hints from Darius's interactions, his care for others, a dream buried beneath years of practicality. Darius set the paper down with care. "Why me?" he asked, his tone measured. Nathaniel met his gaze. "Because you remind me of the man I once was, and the man I should have been advocating for all along." Silence settled, heavy but not strained. Darius regarded him for a long moment, then nodded, not acceptance, not yet, but an acknowledgement. It was enough for now. Nathaniel straightened, adjusting his coat. "Think it over," he said, gesturing to the document. "Let me know by the end of the week." As he turned to leave, Darius's voice stopped him, low and steady. "I didn't do it for a reward, you know." Nathaniel glanced back. "I know," he replied. "That's why you're the right person for this." With that, he stepped out, the bell chiming behind him. He left Brooklyn Market a different man, one recommitted to the values he had nearly lost, and confident that Darius Thompson's quiet strength would help him rebuild what mattered most.